It's a great pleasure to have you this afternoon for this webinar on the EU's climate diplomacy. And many thanks for the Egmont team for the preparatory work. I would like to start with a few words on the context, starting with the international context. 2020 was supposed to be a super year for climate diplomacy. The follow-up of COP21 and the implementation of the Paris Agreement was and still is the main issue. But after the failure of COP25 in Madrid last year, the climate negotiation process was disorganized by the COVID-19 crisis, and COP26 was cancelled and postponed to November 2021. Because of the pandemic, climate negotiations risk no longer to be handled as the main priority. Bigger member states are reluctant to abide by the objectives set in Paris. They are even less committed to defining more ambitious national targets. Yet, civil society remains mobilized on issues related to climate, and this is particularly the case in Belgium today. On the European level, when she presented her ambitious Green Deal plan to counter climate change, Ursula von der Leyen benefited from a favorable political and social context. On 12 December 2019, the European Council endorsed the objective of achieving a climate neutral EU by 2050, in line with the Paris Agreement. In January 2020, the Foreign Affairs Council adopted conclusions on climate diplomacy. Climate change was addressed during the October meeting of the European Council, and the subject will be tackled again next week at the European Council on the 11th of December. In the post-COVID-19 world, the Green Deal has been incorporated in the so-called recovery plan. And obviously, the European Green Deal represents a paradigm shift in the climate policy of the EU. The European Green Deal not only provides a comprehensive strategy and a roadmap to reach climate neutrality in 2050, it also confirms the ambition of the EU to become a global leader. Internal efforts within the EU should be combined with a strong Green Deal diplomacy. The EU must focus on convincing third countries to take their share in the fight against climate change. Now, the objective of our webinar today is twofold. First, concentrate on the global dimension seen from an EU perspective with a few questions like, will Europe's leadership materialize or will the EU fail to deliver? Will the Green Deal objectives affect other external EU policies like trade, like transport, like energy, like industry? How will the EU deal with the divergences between its member states and within its own institutions? And then aside from the global dimension, there's the national dimension, because climate policy has always been very divisive in the country I know best. What are the main priorities for Belgium's climate policy and how can the EU help to reach these objectives? How should we deal with the divergences that are likely to come up again in the coordination process? To introduce these debates, we are very honored to have with us today Marc Vanheukelen, former EU ambassador to WTO in Geneva, All-Class advisor and ambassador at large for climate diplomacy, and Christian de Lannoy, director, special envoy for climate and environment at the Belgian Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Many thanks to you both for accepting our invitations. And before we start, I would like to make just a few brief points on procedure. This is a public event. The session will be recorded. I would suggest that all those of you who want to raise a question do so by using the chat box that will be monitored by our colleague Guillaume Van Der Loo. Please don't forget to mention your name and perhaps also your affiliation. It makes things easier for our webinar. I will now, without further ado, ask kindly each panelist to intervene shortly. And after this presentation, we will take the written questions. Marc, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francois. I've been asked to give you a sort of a bird's eye view on the EU's climate diplomacy in the run-up to Glasgow, which normally spoken would have happened this month, or yeah, indeed November 2020, but which, as you already mentioned, has been postponed for well-known reasons. To situate climate diplomacy in the EU context, the easiest is to start with the Foreign Affairs conclusions of January of this year, which tells the European External Action Service, the Commission, as well as the diplomacies of the member states to step up the outreach and try to convince third countries to enhance their climate action and their climate ambition. The reason is simple. Indeed, the European Union is a world leader on climate change, but even if we do as we are planning to do or even overachieve, we are not going to save the planet. We're only responsible for 8% of emissions, so this is something that really has to be taken on globally. For climate diplomacy, you also have to understand that the Paris Agreement, which is going to celebrate its 5th anniversary in 2 weeks' time, the Paris Agreement is obviously a milestone in the multilateral effort to combat climate change, but on the other hand, it's also an empty shell. The Paris Agreement will only achieve cuts in emissions when individual partner countries of the UNFCCC make commitments and then live by those commitments. So although the UNFCCC is a multilateral process, its success depends fully on unilateral action. And therefore, climate diplomacy is about convincing others to do more, to cut further and faster. Like with any diplomacy, to be effective, you've got to have 3 characteristics. The first is you've got to speak to the right people, not necessarily those who are already convinced. That's the easy part. The harder part is to talk to those people in third countries that will determine the outlook of a country's economy and its energy mix. Those are the ones who will determine where a country is with regard to greenhouse gas emissions 20 or 30 years down the line. So you have got to speak to those who matter in terms of energy, in terms of transport, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of agriculture. Second, diplomacy has got to be sustained. It is not very effective to speak to a third country once. You've got to speak to them very regularly, make sure that you can bring home the point and don't leave them alone. Get back to them so that if they have needs and Europe can provide advice, then we have to do that. Thirdly, any diplomacy has to be tailor-made. What you tell the Russians is very different from what you tell the Indians or the Brazilians. It's got to be something that is a narrative that strikes the right balance with the country you're talking to. As I said, climate action happens actually on 3 levels. The multilateral level is the one of the UNFCCC, and there, obviously, the next milestone will be Glasgow, November 2021, where we need to still complete the so-called rule book of the Paris Agreement. But frankly speaking, the multilateral dimension right now matters less. What really matters is what happens in terms of the commitments of individual countries, what they want to do in terms of climate neutrality by a certain date. As François said, the European Union has committed to become climate neutral in 2050, But of course, if you want to get there, you've got to put intermediate milestones. So that then raises the question, all right, so you say you want to be climate neutral in 2050, what does that mean for 2030? Which is the story of the nationally determined contributions. Countries are supposed to come up with clear indications as to what they want to do in 2030, and they should do so before Glasgow. Then there is also a lot of plurilateral action ongoing. Plurilateral action is the sort of coalitions of the willing and the influential, something that the UK COP presidency sets a lot of store by. These will presumably be preponderantly thematic subjects, like what are we going to do with regard to the phase out of coal worldwide? What are we going to do with regard to methane? What are we going to do with regard to technical standards for cars and their emissions worldwide? So on these three things, we'll have to work through climate diplomacy in the next 12 months. François mentioned that COVID has upended, has disrupted the process. We wanted to have COP26 this month. We now are, in a way, 12 months behind. But on the other hand, COVID has perhaps been also a sort of silver lining to a big cloud. As a result of the deep economic slump many countries in the world are going through, countries have now embarked on a pretty strong expansionary policy through government expenditure. The European Union is a case in point. We're going to mobilize over the next 7 years, if everything goes according to plan, through the normal budget as well as through the EU Recovery Fund, we're going to mobilize 1.8 trillion, so 1,800 billion euros in 7 years' time. This is the chance of a lifetime. If we don't get it right now, we will be spent out. We won't have money left if we don't do it right this time. So people understand that if we really want to build back better and get our economies back on their feet, we've got to make sure that the money is used not to build the economy of the past, but the economy of the future. So a lot of emphasis, not only in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, is now put on getting the economy on a low carbon trajectory, of making sure that the billions we're going to spend go into sectors that will indeed be low carbon. So for that purpose, it is important that we have this 1.8 trillion budget. And the European Council has already decided that 30% of that money should be climate related. Very practically, with regard to, have I lost you? Just hold on.
No, we hear you loud and clear.
Okay, because I have lost my, yeah, I'm back, sorry. Very practically, what have we done in terms of climate diplomacy? We've organized many webinars with the rest of the world already. As far as we are concerned at the EU level, this morning we had our 57th webinar that we have done with various parts of the world. We have developed what we call climate diplomacy engagement notes. So for the 7-8 big emitters in the world, we have produced notes of between 10 and 15 pages, setting out the context, the political context in which you need to place climate change discussions in the country, coming out with the right narrative, coming out with what we believe to be the ambition benchmarks for that country, and then also coming up with sort of offers for cooperation. In terms of the tools that the European Union has at its disposal to convince others to do more than they currently are planning, there are in a way three things that we have. One is the narrative. to tell them that increasingly more and more people see climate action not as a cost, an economic cost, and an environmental benefit, but also as a source of economic efficiency and growth. More and more people realize that climate action is not a brake on economic growth, it is a new stimulus. The best story to tell there is the one of renewable energy. Right now, wind energy and solar energy are cheaper than gas and coal generated electricity. And perhaps the same can happen with regard to a number of sectors that are currently very hard to abate. Secondly, the carrots. In the development cooperation for the next 7 years, 25% of our money will be set aside for climate, be it for Africa, Latin America, or other parts of the world. And thirdly, we also have sticks. We will come up in June of next year with the carbon border adjustment mechanism. We want to address through that the problem of carbon leakage. If as a result of climate action in the European Union, we get more imports or companies leave to produce in a more lax climate policy environment in third countries, we will introduce a mechanism at the border where importers will have to pay a price that is similar to the one our producers have to pay, for instance, in the context of our emissions trading scheme. Let me finish, because the idea is that we have interaction, by saying that climate diplomacy is going to go through a very intensive process in the next 12 months. 2021 should be a vintage year for climate. We are already now in a much better place than we were 4 months ago, as a result of the announcement of China, Japan, South Korea, South Africa, Canada, and hopefully soon the US, that they will go for climate neutrality. That definitely will be a game changer. So we have to make sure we can make maximum progress in 2021. It should be a vintage year for 2021 for climate change, in the sense that if we get good climate neutrality targets in 2050, and we get ambitious NDCs for 2030, the private sector will know what the direction of travel is. That will unleash a lot of innovation, a lot of investment. That's where we need to go. Back to you, François.
Thank you very much, Marc. Thank you very much for pointing out first that indeed Europe by itself cannot save the planet. Also by putting the emphasis on unilateral acts and the way member states across the planet will make known their engagement for climate diplomacy. Thank you also for your optimistic view. I mean, I noticed what you said about COVID might be a chance in a way, and also detailing the tools, and also what you said about how you see diplomacy, that it has to be, I mean, directed to the right people, a sustained process, and tailor-made. I think that were characteristics which are very important. Thank you for your expose. Christian, the floor is yours.
Merci, François. Marc just described very eloquently the objectives and instruments of EU's climate diplomacy. Belgium is definitely supportive of those efforts. We subscribe to EU's ambition of achieving climate neutrality by 2050. We share the consensus on the need of a sustainable transformation of our society, of our economies. The Green Deal can indeed lead to numerous opportunities and a positive agenda. Since, like Marc underlined, the EU is responsible for less than 10% of global greenhouse gas emission, we will only have a significant impact if we succeed in involving a large number of third countries in the transition to carbon neutrality and green growth. The Council of Ministers of the EU has adopted conclusions on climate diplomacy since quite a few years now. These conclusions give a very useful political guideline to our collective action. Over the time, the conclusions have become more detailed and actions by the European Union have become more diverse. For a long time, the main focus of climate diplomacy was on the negotiation process within the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now the focus is not anymore on the negotiation of a new legal instrument. It is on implementation of existing instruments and on setting ambitious objectives. The scope of climate diplomacy is now much wider than it used to be. And a series of tools have been developed, démarches, public diplomacy events, engagement notes on specific countries or issues. Those tools can make climate diplomacy of the European Union better work, which is really need at this time where it is especially relevant. Getting other G20 economies on board will be of paramount importance, as those countries represent 80% of global emissions. A substantial increase of climate ambitions and goals of those countries should be one of the EU's top diplomatic priorities. The recent Chinese announcement at the United Nations General Assembly aiming for a peak of its emission before 2030 and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 is a very significant signal, especially since China accounts for 28% of global emissions. Such an announcement creates optimism and hopefully is the start of more action and ambition from all the major economies. With the COVID crisis, we may have lost some time and we should rebuild momentum with global actors. But COVID crisis is also an opportunity because it forced our institutions to make considerable budgetary means available to support the economy. And this represents a unique opportunity to serve a double goal, the economic recovery and the greening of our societies. EU should now redouble its diplomatic efforts to engage with major economies, regional organizations, and all other stakeholders. And member states can effectively support the EU in this climate diplomacy efforts. Member states can also mobilize their influence, their expertise, and their financial resources to put our partners on the path to green growth. Member states do have their own levers, which are complementary to those of the European Union. They have national diplomatic networks, sometimes embassies and consular missions in countries and large cities where the EU does not necessarily have a delegation. They sometimes have a privileged position in certain countries with which they have special or historical links. They can also play a role in multilateral organizations where the EU is not or insufficiently represented, such as, for instance, development banks. And they also have tools of the development cooperation. The EU and its member states are providing more than half of the world's official development assistance. A large share of it is still given by the member states. How can then Belgium, in particular, support the climate diplomacy efforts? We can do it actually through each of the tools I just mentioned. Belgium has a quite extended diplomatic network, which is often called upon in support of climate diplomacy actions. Belgium is determined to support climate diplomacy efforts of the EU in international multilateral organizations, with a special eye on those organizations where the EU does not have a full status or representation. And we also are using our development cooperation tools. Belgium the Belgian government intends to contribute more in the future to climate financing, and has decided to increase substantially its climate finance, with the idea to bring our total international climate financing next year at a level of around 100 million euro. Belgium will continue to focus its climate finance specifically on the adaptation needs of the least developed countries. I should also mention the role we can play, for instance, as a member of the United Nations Security Council. Until the end of the year, Belgium is a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. Assuming that climate change is proven to be a threat multiplier, Belgium, with a view to preventing conflicts, has been seeking to ensure that climate is more systematically addressed in Security Council resolutions. And this can also be seen as a specific contribution to climate diplomacy. Maybe a word about the coordination, all those efforts by the European institution, its member states needs. Also within Belgium, there is a very active coordination around climate ongoing between the federal state and the regions, which are responsible for a large part of the implementation of climate policies. And a set of coordination bodies have been put in place since the 90s to coordinate environmental and climate policy. And federal and regional governments will also start a discussion on the collective international climate financing ambition for the years to come. The coordination at the European level between member states and with European institutions is, of course, also extremely important. If we want to make a full use of the set of tools that have been developed, more coordination and some more burden sharing is probably needed. And the Green Diplomacy Network among member states of the European Union has been mandated by the Council to oversee and coordinate EU climate diplomacy efforts. It is a very useful tool which allows exchange of information to coordinate démarches and other public diplomatic initiatives, and it will probably play more role in the coming months. Early next year, the Council of Ministers of the European Union is expected to adopt again conclusions on climate diplomacy. These conclusions come at a very crucial moment. They will show the new prominence of climate diplomacy in the external action of the European Union and its member states. And I'm confident that this will give a new impulse to further improve EU climate diplomacy at a time where it is more than ever relevant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you for you giving your interpretation of the tools, describing also the Belgian support, the complementarity between Belgium and EU and international institutions, for describing as well the coordination tools which are extremely important in the case of Belgium. I think we will take a few questions, but before referring to Guillaume, I would like to. I had one question in mind, which has to do with governance. How will the EU deal how will the EU deal with the divergences between its member states and within its institutions? I mean, let me give you two concrete examples. The fact that the commissioner in charge for climate diplomacy is Mr. Timmermans, has not the best how would I say, relationship with certain member states in the East for reasons you know. Second, there is also this potential turf war between the external aspect, the responsibility of Vice President Borrell and Vice President Timmermans. How do you see? How do you think we can avoid these pitfalls, which would make the EU diplomacy in terms of climate less effective? But now, Guillaume, do you have some questions to put forward? Because I think the idea is to have at least 2 or 3 before hearing your replies. Guillaume, over to you.
Indeed, many thanks, Francois. I have collected, there's a lot of interest and a lot of questions, so I will just have to cherry pick a bit. So in addition to the question that Francois just raised, I mean, there is, for example, a question by Ms. Marie Koorman from Reboot Democracy. And she's asking basically, will the sticks mentioned by Mr. Vanheukelen make it necessary to amend all the free trade agreements that have been signed with third countries? Now, if you allow me to narrow down that question a bit, basically, I think the question is, how and to what extent can climate diplomacy contribute to the trade, the climate dimension and trade agreements, and for example, in these chapters on trade and sustainable development, there are, for example, a lot of interesting developments currently going on in the context of Mercosur and the signature of Mercosur to have a few additional, under pressure from the European Parliament, a few additional commitments on the Mercosur side in the area of climate and sustainable development at large. So I think the question could be indeed, how and to what extent could climate diplomacy contribute to, more greener trade agreements? And if I can link this, for example, also with the question of Mr. Roux, it would be DG Trade mainly in charge, or how could this work in practice? So I propose that we start with these 2 questions from François and Marie, and that we then collect another batch. And obviously, both speakers feel free to comment on that.
Shall I set the ball rolling, or yes? On these questions, with regard to, the first 2 raised by Francois, which he put under the chapeau of governance. Obviously, there are divergences. Clearly, they have countries like Finland that has set itself a target to become climate neutral in 2040. There are others for whom 2050 was actually already very hard, and the target has been set for the EU as a whole, not for each individual country. I think we're going to have a similar situation on the 11th of December, if everything goes according to plan, where the European Union will set itself the goal of cutting its greenhouse gas emissions by 55% compared to 1990 for the EU as a whole. Individual countries will not yet want to do that. Obviously, that's not first best, but that's where we are. As a matter of fact, it's not completely unprecedented. If you look at the current situation, the European Union will reach its 2020 target of cutting its emissions. It was said that we would then cut by 23%. We're going to get presumably to 25, 26, but that's for the EU as a whole. Several of our member states will not be able to reach the target that was set for the effort sharing regulation. So that the part of emissions that was to be dealt with by individual member states. So there will be divergences. We are trying to do that by setting targets for the EU as a whole. And in addition, of course, through the budget, a number of countries are going to get substantial amounts of money to accomplish their targets. There is this Just Transition Fund, which will be targeted to a fairly limited number of countries to get, in particular, the coal phase out that we all need. On the turf war between the various institutions, right now, I think there's not much of a problem. And I'm not saying that because I happen to have a 33-year career in the Commission now for 2.5 years in the EES. But right now, for instance, if you talk or if you speak about the two political top people, namely Mr. Borrell and Mr. Timmermans, they both see eye to eye. And Mr. Borrell, I think, is as much convinced of the need to do something about greenhouse gas emissions than Mr. Timmermans. So there is no rivalry, and in a way, rivalry would be a complete no-brainer. This is an area where the EU leads. There are not many areas where the EU is seen as a world leader. Climate change is an area where we are world leaders. So in a way, it's not too difficult to reach out. We're not too defensive, but we've got to try and make others change their mind and enhance their ambition. On trade and climate change, the creation of a carbon border adjustment mechanism will apply to all countries. If you have concluded an FTA with the European Union, but you have very high carbon emissions, for instance, for the manufacturing of your cement or your steel, you're not going to be exempted. Huh? So an FTA doesn't give you any privileged status with regard to the future carbon border adjustment mechanism. On the issue of enhancing climate change provisions in FTAs, well, the debate is ongoing, as you know. It's not going to be easy to do anything about the FTAs that have already been concluded and ratified. The question is then, what about the trade agreements that have been concluded but not yet ratified, like Mercosur? And how about the trade agreements that we are currently negotiating, like the ones with some ASEAN countries or with Australia and New Zealand? Well, the jury is out. We'll see what can be done. On Mercosur, I don't think, say, a personal opinion, I think that is also the view that exists in the Commission. It's going to be very hard to reopen the FTA. However, what we can negotiate is a sort of side agreement where Mercosur countries, and notably Brazil, make commitments, for instance, with regard to their afforestation or deforestation policy, so that you have some sort of a side agreement. That's not unique. We did the same with Colombia with regard to labor rights. So you could have that sort of an agreement that would complement the Mercosur agreement, but to reopen the agreement as such is going to be difficult. Moreover, let us bear in mind that what you put in the Sustainable Development chapter on, for instance, climate change, should have a relationship with trade. And for instance, even with Mercosur, that link is not obvious. We're going to import more or less 100,000 tons of beef from Mercosur extra compared to what we are currently importing. If you want to make a link with climate change, you will have to demonstrate, if you want to make this enforceable under the dispute settlement regime of the FTA, you'll have to be able to demonstrate that there is a link between cattle or between beef exports from Brazil or from Argentina and deforestation. That's not an easy one. So clearly we have to do better than we are currently doing. The Sustainable Development chapters of the FTAs are not binding really. They don't fall under the normal dispute settlement regime. I think we should look into that for the future. But let us not forget that, say, a trade agreement can, under the best of circumstances, never be a substitute for a direct agreement with a country in terms of climate efforts. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you, Christian.
Thank you, François. Well, I think the European Union is used to deal with differences between member states, between different institutions, and there is nothing very special about the current discussion about climate achievements. I think I'm very confident that the Council in December will lead to an agreement around what is on the table. And well, as for Belgium, we are usually not a country with an especially extreme position in any debate, and there is no reason why it would become the case right now. About the trade agreements, I think climate diplomacy can definitely contribute to a better trade. It should certainly be a dimension of climate diplomacy to contribute to that. And with trade agreements, the European Union has got a powerful tool to make policies in some partners a bit greener than it is now. And Belgium as a member state will certainly attach a lot of importance to sustainable development chapters within the trade agreements, which are very important.
Thank you very much, Christian. I'm turning now back again to Guillaume for additional questions. Guillaume?
Many thanks, and I do apologize for the participants that are asking questions and that I'm not picking up, but I need to be selective. So actually, we just discussed a bit the nexus between, climate and trade, but there was also, for example, a question of Mr. Patrick Bilot, who is asking whether or not, or to what extent, the EU or the member state countries will use conditionality on the climate measures in its development assistance. So that would be, the first broader question: how and to what extent, especially in the context of the new MFF, will the EU use, a kind of a conditionality externally on climate measures? And then secondly, there's a question from Benjamin Botson from the UCL, Université de Louvain. And he is actually also flagging that the Commission and the ES are envisaging this new communication on multilateralism. It is expected early next year, I believe, but it would be, first of all, interesting to hear more information on when we can expect that strategy, firstly. And secondly, what will be the climate dimension of that document or strategy? So maybe we can start with these two questions. So first, climate conditionality, and secondly, this new multilateralism strategy. And obviously, we're interested very much in the views of both speakers.
Marc, please.
On the first question, of course, it all depends what you mean by conditionality, but what is clear is that 25% of the NDICI money, of the new instruments for development aid, 25% will have to be climate related. In other words, climate mitigation or climate adaptation. And so we have given clear instructions to our negotiators for the next programming round with developing countries that 25% of that money has to be set aside for climate. That's not going to be a walk in the park because there's still quite a number of countries in the world that believe, first of all, that climate change is a sort of luxury problem. And secondly, in as much as there is a problem, it is one of developed countries making. And so therefore, the developed world has to take care of that. Now, I think those sorts of positions, I think, are changing because, first of all, countries realize that they are, especially many developing countries, are the first to suffer from climate change. Secondly, right now, 70% of emissions in the world are from developing countries. So even if the developed world would do all in its possibilities to reduce its emissions very quickly to zero, we will not get there. The climate change challenge is such that everyone has to contribute. Of course, I'm talking about all developing countries, including China, which is responsible for 28% of emissions. On multilateralism, if I'm not mistaken, next month, I know that the first draft is ready of the communication on multilateralism. So it should come out, I believe, in the next weeks, possibly still this side of 2021, but then if not, it will be January. Secondly, yes, obviously, climate change is one area where multilateral action is called for. I cannot think of any problem that is more global than climate change. So if multilateralism is not something that has to be applied to a subject like climate change, then I have difficulties understanding. Having said that, 80% of all emissions are from G20 countries. 20 countries in the world are responsible for 80% of emissions. So yes, the whole world has to make an effort, but some more than others.
Thank you very much, Marc. Christian, maybe?
About the conditionality in cooperation, I think the question was also on those aspects. Well, climate and environment is an overarching principle of our development cooperation. It means it should be integrated in all the actions we have, but there is the governmental cooperation is based on agreements with the local authorities, and there will no be any conditionality based on whatsoever on linked to climate with those countries. We are there to help. Our climate specific action is especially focused on adaptation, knowing that the poorest countries are not responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions, but are victims of the impact of climate change. We are there to help them to adapt their infrastructures to climate change and their impact. Yes, the multilateral integration of a climate dimension in multilateral activities of multilateral institution seems obvious indeed. And as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, it is certainly something on which European Union should focus.
Thank you very much. I mean, concerning multilateralism, of course, there is this double opportunity. On one side, the new Biden administration, and on the other, the declarations made by China recently. Maybe you two would like to mention something about this. But please, Guillaume, any other questions out there?
Yes, definitely. So it is not a surprise that a few participants are asking what, and this then of course is mainly for Christian, to what extent that the new Belgian government will, I mean, is there a kind of a more fundamental change, or could there be, or will there be a fundamental or a small change in the EU's climate policies? I mean, obviously the Belgian position is very much in line with the EU's position, as you just mentioned. But could we expect some changes, or I mean, different priorities under the new government? And then secondly, I think this relates to something that Mr. Vanheukelen mentioned, is the issue of climate mitigation and adaptation. So the question is, where in the EU's climate diplomacy, I mean, how is this relation between the two playing out? To what extent is the EU focusing more on climate mitigation or adaptation, or how, in any case, most likely hand in hand? But how is the EU, I mean, pursuing a fair balance between that, and what we can expect in the next couple of years on that? I think we can start with these two questions and then collect a few other ones if we still have time.
Marc, please.
The Belgian question I'm going to leave to Christian, but the one on climate adaptation and mitigation and the sort of relative weight, it's, I think, fair to say that until recently the weight was very, very much on mitigation. I think there still is a larger weight on mitigation than on adaptation, but the weight of the latter has grown for two reasons. The first is, especially if you talk to, for instance, countries in Africa, you've got to start with adaptation. Because for them, climate change is a deterioration of the conditions in which they live, in which they work, in which they cultivate their land. So if you want to have a useful conversation with African countries, you have to start with adaptation. And it's only then that you can then have a discussion on how they should avoid becoming major emitters in future. Africa currently is responsible for 1.5% of all emissions in the world. But if they make the wrong decisions on what their future energy supply is going to be in 20 years' time, even when Africa starts growing fast, we're going to have a major problem there. They have to make sure that they do not get into fossil fuel energy expansion, but that they leapfrog immediately into renewable energy. Of course, on the other hand, adaptation is still a subject that we need to work on for a reason that has to do with physics. Nature is very inert. Even if tomorrow we would stop emitting any gases in the atmosphere, any greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, global warming will continue for another 10, 20 years. And the reason is that nature takes time to adjust. That worked to our advantage when we were initially emitting a lot and nature did not respond. Nature will keep on responding with a lagged effect. So yes, we're going to have an increase in temperature, even if we stop emitting tomorrow. And that will mean further increases in extreme weather patterns. So adaptation will have to be part of the equation for reasons of physics.
Thank you, Marc. Christian, on the Belgian issue?
Yes, thank you, François. Last year, Belgium approved, together with the other member states of the European Union, the conclusions of the European Council stating the overall objective of attaining carbon neutrality by 2050. We now have a new government since a few weeks. When a new government begins, there is always a government agreement and a political declaration, which very clearly states that Belgium subscribes to the objectives of the EU's objective of achieving climate neutrality by 2050, and about the objectives of the Green Deal. There are ongoing discussions between the federal and federated entities to on the details on which form all this could take.
Thank you very much. I see that there is a question about the involvement of local governments. Could you, Christian, explain to us how does this work at the Belgian level?
Yes. Since the 90s, the regions in Belgium have got very significant competences in the field of environment and for many aspects of climate policy. And well, and also for external aspects of those issues. It means that any international position of Belgium on climate is the result of a negotiation, and there are mechanisms which are put in place in that effect, and which are actually working constantly and produce consensus on all current negotiating issues.
Thank you very much. Maybe, unless Marc wants to make a remark, the floor is back for you, Guillaume, to take maybe a last round of questions, because time is running out. Guillaume?
Okay, then I will be short and snappy. So there was one question from a speaker that is interested in the climate dimension of the EU's financial investment instruments. So mainly, I mean, of course, the EU has numerous external investment instruments at display in relation to, I mean, the different investment banks, for example, out there. So how is, I mean, climate diplomacy and the topic of climate as such integrated in EU's financial investment plans, especially I think in its neighborhood or its neighboring countries?
Thank you, Guillaume. Marc?
On that, with regard to our own development banks, I believe that Europe is very much at the forefront. The European Investment Bank is going to become the first international climate bank in the world. It has just adopted its roadmap to become a climate bank. Similarly, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has greened its portfolio very much and is aligning its activities very much to the Paris Agreement. What is not so promising, as was made clear in the fact that quite a number of multilateral development banks were unable to sign the Financing Common Declaration of the 12th of November, where all development banks in the world, 450 banks in total, decided to step up their action to go to a low carbon economy. The World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank clearly are laggards compared to where the European Investment Bank and the EBRD are. And I think one of the challenges that we'll have in 2021, a part of our homework, definitely now that we have a new administration in the US, is to make sure that the World Bank and other multilateral development banks do better in terms of their role that they can play, not only in terms of their own portfolio, but in terms of the technical assistance they can give to countries, for instance, to sketch out a low carbon long-term scenario, to make sure that with their technical expertise, they can help the governments of developing countries to get to the low carbon trajectory that they need to get on.
Thank you very much. Christian, you want to add something?
Yes, thank you, François. At the national level, we also are active in a series of investment institutions. There is the National Belgium Financial Investment Corporation, BIO, which gets a substantial budget each year to be invested in climate projects in the developing world. And Belgium is also a member of the most prominent international development banks, where we will definitely support climate-friendly policies.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you to you both once again for your many insights. I won't sum it up, but I have a sense of optimism from you both on what is cooking. We'll see what happens at the next European Council next week, and then we'll see if 2021 is as promising as Marc was envisaging. So thank you again for being there and for sharing your thoughts with us. Before closing, I would like to make maybe two announcements. My first announcement is a reference to a recent policy brief, which was written by Francisca Petri. The title is Revisiting EU Climate and Energy Diplomacy, a Starting Point for Green Diplomacy. If you have a chance to read it, please do, because it is very interesting. And the second announcement I would like to make is that Egmont, as a neutral platform, is planning to convene a webinar on the Green Deal itself, this 1 year after, with the participation of Sarah Nelen and Jean-Pascal Van Ypersele. And that should happen somewhere in the second half of January next year. So we'll keep you all posted. But please, if you have the possibility, I think it is worth attending to. So thank you again to you both, to the whole Egmont team and all those that made this webinar possible. Hope to see you before next year. If I don't, I wish you a happy 2021, which has to be better than 2020 anyway. This is the end of our webinar, and thank you for all those who attended.
Thank you.